Would you go sit down so I can start class? So would you go sit down so I can start class? Good morning. It is time for us to get started. Open your Bibles to Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5. We're in the middle of talking about the Sermon on the Mount. Because of as much material as is found in there, we're probably going to be in here several weeks. But we've talked about the Beatitudes, first part of the chapter. We talked about influence with salt and light. This morning we're going to be looking at the relationship between Christ and the kingdom and the law of Moses. He gets to verse 17, which is where we're going to pick up this morning, Matthew 5, verse 17. Do not think I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. Truly I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, not an iota nor a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whosoever relaxes one of these least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. Whosoever does them and teach them we call great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. One of the things that Jesus was accused of by the Pharisees and leaders of the Jews was denigrating the old law, de-emphasizing it. Nothing could be further from the truth. We still have issues in the world today, the people understanding the difference between the old law and the new. They want to mix the two. They want to, and we're going to get into it in just a couple moments. But there's part of verse 17 and verse 18 they misuse in order to accomplish that. The Jews were looking forward to and were expecting the Messiah. They were expecting him to come. When he came, they misunderstood him. As we mentioned, they accused him of trying to belittle the law, which is not what he did, and we'll talk about that in a bit more detail in a few moments. But if you notice verse 17, do not think I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. Now, if you stop right there, which is what most people do, and you get the idea that the law was never intended to be done away with. I did not come to abolish the law or the prophets. Now, the Jews divided the Old Testament into three categories. There was the law, there were the writings, which were Solomon, Proverbs, and those things, and the prophets. But oftentimes when they were talking, they would just say law and the prophets. And many times they would just say law, but include all of the Old Testament. So Jesus said, I did not come to abolish the law or the prophets. The word abolish means to cancel or do away with, to destroy. And so he says, I did not come to abolish the law or the prophets. Now, read the next part of the verse. But to fulfill them. What does the word fulfill mean? I've got this. You'll notice on the bottom of the screen up there it says 3-year loan on the car. If you go to a car dealership and you buy a car, and you get a 3-year loan on that car, if you decide in 18 months you're not going to make those payments anymore, they're going to come repossess that car, but you have broken the contract. You violated the contract. The contract is null and void. Now, if you make those 3 years worth of payments, 36 payments, at the end of those 3 years, that contract is not enforceable anymore. They can't come tell you and you got to make another payment because you didn't pay them all. But the contract is still done away with. It's not enforced anymore. It has been fulfilled. That's what Jesus means when he says he would fulfill the law. The law was given, Galatians chapter 5, Paul says the law was a schoolmaster to bring us to Christ. It was a tutor, it was a teacher, it was to prepare us for the coming of the Messiah. And so the law was intended to get the world ready and Christ ready for the coming of Jews ready for the coming of the gospel. When we get to the gospel, the law has fulfilled its purpose. It's the reason for being here. And so Christ did not destroy it. He didn't annul it. He didn't violate it. He fulfilled it. And when he fulfilled it, it had completed its purpose.
Yeah, there's some religious groups that want to ignore that last part of it being fulfilled. They want to take the first part and hang on that and totally ignore the fact that it is fulfilled.
Now, the fact of the matter is, he did not abolish it.
No.
He didn't destroy it. He didn't annul it. He didn't cancel it. He didn't violate it. He didn't teach people to violate it. He replaced it because it had been fulfilled. Its purpose had been completed, and so they didn't need it anymore. When the contract is fulfilled, you don't enforce the contract anymore. And so when the law is fulfilled, that means you don't. One guy had this illustration, and I kind of like this. You take an acorn, you smash it with a hammer, the acorn is no more. You take that acorn and you plant it in the ground, what happens? What happens to the acorn? It's gone. It grows into a tree, the acorn's gone. Now in both instances, the acorn's gone. In one it was destroyed, the other one it was fulfilled. It met its purpose. So that's kind of the idea Jesus talked about. Now you go to the next verse. Truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota or a dot will pass from the law. Now again, that's where they want to stop. See? Jesus said not one dot, not one iota. The problem with that is nobody lives by that. Not even Orthodox Jews live by that. Because they don't offer sacrifices anymore. They don't make 3 trips to Jerusalem anymore. They don't do any of those things that the law commands. Nobody that I know of lives by the law. Not completely. They pick and choose. I'll do this, 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 but I'm not doing that. Not one dot or one iota. One commentator said that means the dotting of an I or the crossing of a T. The least little mark in Scripture. If you know anything about Hebrew, you know Hebrew was originally written with consonants and no vowels. My name in original Hebrew would have been spelled RGR. And in order to help them with reading, they started making little marks over the top of the consonants that would indicate what vowel it was. And those little marks are what he's talking about when he talks about not one iota or one jot. It would be done away with the law until when? Until all is accomplished. The very same thing he said in the previous verse. It'll be fulfilled. Now he says until all is accomplished. The old law, the law of Moses, served its purpose. Its purpose was to, I think, primarily threefold. Number one, to keep the knowledge of God alive on the earth. Because if God hadn't given somebody something, the whole world would have been pagan. Look at what happened to the Gentile world. So to keep the knowledge of God. Number two, to point out the danger of sin. Paul talks about in the fact in the book of Romans, if the old law had not said, thou shalt not steal, I would not have known it was wrong to steal. I actually watched a discussion on internet yesterday between a man who says he was an atheist and a guy who is a religious person, and the guy who was an atheist basically said Adolf Hitler did nothing wrong by his standards, because without God you have no objective standard. If you take God out of the picture, man gets to decide what right and wrong is. So the law taught us what sin was and taught us the seriousness of sin. Number three, the law served its purpose in getting us ready, getting the world ready for the coming of Christ. That's what the law was about. When Christ came and Christ lived and Christ died and Christ resurrected and the church was established, the purpose for the law was done. We didn't need it anymore. Romans chapter 8 and verse 3, Paul talked about the fact what the law could not do. What is it the law could not do? forgive sin, take away guilt. There's no method of forgiveness under the old law. Well, wait a minute, preacher. How about all those animal sacrifices? What's Hebrews 10 say? It's not possible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sin. Those sacrifices were a type and a shadow of the true sacrifice, which is Christ. And if you look in verse 15 of Hebrews chapter 9, it tells you those people who lived under the old law, their transgressions were forgiven by the new covenant. People are not going to heaven because they kept the law of Moses perfectly, because nobody could do it. The law of Moses said, thou shalt not steal, but it provided no remedy for the man who did. Thou shalt not commit adultery, but it provided no remedy for the man who did. There's no answer to sin under the old law. Under the gospel there is. Christ brought. Now if you talk about fulfilling the law, all things that are accomplished, there are three things that Christ specifically did. Number one, he's the only person who ever walked on the face of the earth who kept the law perfectly. He was in all points tempted like as we are, yet without sin. Now, anytime you read I think sometimes some people misuse this. Anytime you read something where it says that the Jews were talking about Christ did this or Christ did that, they accused him of violating the law. There's a difference in accusing him of violating the law and him violating the law, which he did not do. Secondly, he was the fulfillment of the types and shadows and prophecies in the Old Testament. Someone said one time, and I haven't counted, so I don't know specifically, there are somewhere around 350 prophecies regarding the Messiah in the Old Testament. And Christ fulfilled every single one of them. Not 250, not 275, not 300, not even 349. But every single solitary one of them, Christ fulfilled. The third thing he did in bringing fulfillment to the law is he brought the solution to sin. We just talked about Romans chapter 8. Christ died so that we could have an opportunity at eternal salvation. So he fulfilled the law. Now, when you get to this, not an iota, not a dot, that shows the respect that Christ had for the law. Christ did not denigrate the law. Christ did not downgrade the law. Christ did not destroy the law. Christ lived by the law. And during his lifetime, he taught his disciples to live by the law. Remember that statement where he made when he looked at his disciples and said, those who sit in Moses' seat, whatever they tell you to do, you do, but don't follow their example because they're not doing it themselves. Christ never told anybody to violate the law of Moses, and he never did it himself. Now, he was accused of it. We talked a couple of weeks ago about the fact he healed somebody on the Sabbath, and Jesus said, that's a violation of the law because you work. No, it's not. It's a violation of their interpretation of the Sabbath. It's not a violation of the Sabbath. And so Christ had great respect for the law of Moses. There are several, I want to spend just a couple moments, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but there are a couple of passages in the New Testament I want us to look at that kind of talk about some of these things. Turn with me to Galatians chapter 3. Galatians chapter 3, look at verse 16. The promises were made to Abraham and to his offspring, and it does not say, and to offsprings, referring to many, but referring to one, and to your offspring. My personal preference is for the King James Version. I like the word seed instead of offspring. The promise of Abraham was made to his seed. And Paul made an argument in that verse that that word is singular. And that singular word is a reference to Christ. And all these promises are going to be fulfilled in Christ. Now drop down to verse 19. Why then the law? You've been talking about the promises that came through Christ. instead of Abraham, he says, why the law? It was added because of transgressions, until the seed should come to whom the promise had been made, and it was put in place through angels by an intermediary. It was added because of transgressions until what? Until the seed should come. Now back in verse 16, he told us what the seed was. The seed was Christ. You drop down to verse 23. And before faith came, we were held captive under the law, imprisoned until the coming faith would be revealed. So then the law was our guardian until Christ came, in order that we might be justified by faith. But now that faith has come, we are no longer under a guardian. Again, the King James Version says the word schoolmaster. I heard a man say one time that word translated schoolmaster is not a reference to a teacher. Now, I'm not a Greek scholar, so I don't know this sermon. This is what he said. The word schoolmaster was a reference to the slave whose job it was to get the student to the teacher. Once you got the student to the teacher, that guy didn't have a job anymore at that point. His job is finished because he got the guy to the teacher. He'd show up at the end of class, it's good to school, take the kid back home. If that's true, then the law was our schoolmaster. It was our teacher or our leader to get us to Christ, so Christ could teach us the truth. Now, there are certain things about, the glory of the Lord and those kind of things are forever. But God never intended, when the law was put in place, it was intended to be temporary. Never was intended to be permanent. I want you to think about this simple question. If the law was permanent, how are we getting to heaven? If the law of Moses was in force, still in force, how are you and I getting to heaven? Pardon my English, but we ain't. Not by the law.
The law shows us just how crooked we are.
Yep.
And how bad we need Christ.
Ephesians chapter 2. And this gets very interesting. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 14. He himself is our peace, who hath made both one, hath broken down in his flesh the dividing wall of hostility, hath made us both one. Who's both?
Jews and the Gentiles.
Jews and the Gentiles have been separated by the law. He said Christ has torn down that wall. We're now both one. By abolishing the law of commandments, expressing ordinances that he might create in himself a new man in place of the two, so making peace. Now wait a minute. Christ said, I didn't come to abolish the law. Paul says he abolished the law. But which is it? He abolished in the sense that he took it out of the way. Christ used the word abolish, he's talking about destroying it or canceling it or violating it. Paul is telling him that's not enforced anymore. He might reconcile them both in one body through the cross, thereby killing the hostility. One more verse I want to look at and then we'll move on. Colossians chapter 2. Colossians chapter 2, beginning in verse 13. In you who were dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made alive together with him, having forgiven our trespasses, by canceling the record of debt that was against us with its legal demands. This he set aside, nailing it to the cross. He disarmed the rulers and authorities and put them to open shame by triumphing over them in it. Now he says in verse 14, he canceled the debt that stood against us with its legal demands, nailing it to the cross. What's he talking about? What did he nail to the cross? Sin. What's this record of debt? He's talking about the law. He's talking about the law of Moses. He nailed it to the cross. Now, if you drop down a couple of verses, I'll show you where it tells you that. Look at verse 16. Therefore, let no man pass judgment on you in question of food or drink or with regard to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath. Now, what are all those things signs of? They're part of the law. And he says he nailed it to the cross. He took it out of the way. What did he take out of the way? He took out of the way that law that says you're supposed to watch what you eat, what you drink, what festival you keep, and the Sabbath day. Now, I want to make one more point. There are a lot of people in the religious world today who will tell you what Jesus did was he nailed the ceremonial part of the law to the cross, not the moral part. The Ten Commandments are still in force. They're not part of that moral law. I know that's not so. How do I know that's not so? This verse puts both together. Festivals, food, drink, or Sabbath. Sabbath was a part of the Ten Commandments. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. The Bible never makes a distinction between the ceremonial and the moral part of the law. Man made that distinction. God didn't. The law is the law. And Paul points out the fact if you're going to keep part of it, you've got to keep all of it. And so what Jesus is telling us here in Matthew chapter 5 is there's coming a day when the law is not going to be in force anymore. Now, don't go this extreme and say, well, that means I've heard people, the Bible makes a statement in John chapter 1. The law came by Moses, and grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. That means we have no law, right? We can live any old way we want to. No. There's more in the Bible than just that one verse, but even I can look at that one verse. The law came by Moses, but grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. If you're talking about a complete opposite there, then there is no grace and there is no truth under the old law. Because if grace and truth only came through Jesus and that's all Jesus brought, Moses didn't have any grace. And I know that ain't so. Well, the Bible says so. What's the very first statement it makes about Noah? Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Technically, Noah deserved to die in the flood like everybody else did. He was a sinner just like the rest of them. He wasn't, if we want to use the word horrible, a sinner. Because of the grace of God, he saved Noah and his family. Noah didn't earn that. Now, Noah was a righteous man in the sense of being a man who tried to live according to God's law, and the others did not. That's what made the difference. The fact of the matter is, grace is what saved Noah. So the grace of God is evident throughout all of Scripture, not just the New Testament. So don't take the idea that because the old law had been nailed to the cross, we don't have a law anymore. We do have a law. In fact, the new law, we're going to talk about this some as we get on in chapter 5 of Matthew, the new law is in many instances more stringent than the old one. It requires more in many instances than the old law did. Now you can look at Hebrews chapter 8 and Hebrews chapter 10 and some of the other passages listed there at your own leisure if you want to, but basically the message of that is when Christ died, when the gospel was preached at Pentecost, the old law was done away with. We do not live by the old law, we live under the gospel. And one of the things I try to point out from time to time, I've said this on many occasions, how many of the Ten Commandments do you have to keep? 0. I was told all my life in Sunday school classes, we keep 9 of the 10 commandments. No, we don't. Well, preacher, that means it's okay to steal. No, because Ephesians chapter 4 says you're not supposed to steal. That means it's okay to bear false witness. No, Revelation chapter 1 and verse 8 says you're not supposed to lie. Every one of those commandments that God expects us to live by has been repeated in the new law. Every one of them. We live under the gospel. We don't live under the law. And that is one of the most controversial things in the religious world today. Almost every denominational religion that is out there pulls something out of the old law. And unfortunately, I've heard members of the church do the same thing. I heard a man preach a sermon one time on the fact that women couldn't wear pants. And you know what he based it on? The Old Testament says a woman can't wear a man's clothing. And I said, I have two answers to that. First one is, I'm not going to be caught dead in a pair of women's pants. There is no way in the world those things are men's clothing. And the second thing is, that's in the old law. The old law also says you can't mix two different fabrics in the same piece of material. How many of you have got clothes on that's made out of one fabric? Not very many. There are all kinds of things. The old law said you couldn't eat shrimp. And I kind of like that law. The old law also said you couldn't eat pork. But you could eat locusts. All about you, but I'd a whole lot rather have a bunch of pulled pork than I had a locust. I've never eaten a bug in my life and don't plan on it. Not intentionally anyway. If you grew up in the South, you swallowed a few bugs. So there are principles in the old law that are still enforced in the new law simply because God is God. God's morality, God's nature doesn't change. Murder was illegal under the patriarchal law. Murder was illegal under the law of Moses. Murder is illegal under the gospel. That's because of the nature of God. It's who God is. And it's always been that way, and it will always be that way. Even though how he deals with man may change, and the law that man lives under changes from time to time, God doesn't. You have a question or comment before we move on?
Yeah, I have a question. Jesus was asked what the greatest commandment was, and he answers that we should love God with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength. And then he adds to that that we should love our neighbor as ourselves. Now, these are Old Testament commands. Are they not, in fact, still?
Yes, James. James says so in the book of James. Loving God has always been a part of what we're supposed to be. As I mentioned, there are several things about God that don't change. I kind of got this brought to my mind. I've been reading a new book I came across that God created them male and female, and it's a book about the modern homosexual and transgender movement. And one of the things he points out in that is you go back to all the way back to patriarchal law, you go into Moses' law, you go into the gospel. God's view of homosexuality has never changed. It's the same under all three laws because that's a part of who God is. Yeah. And so, we need to understand, even though the old law has been taken out of the way, the gospel has replaced it. And the gospel has many of the same moral principles and same commandments that the old law had.
Yeah, so I think maybe the question leads you to, okay, why do we read the Old Testament then? And I think that we learned about
That
the
was my
nature-
next point.
Okay. We
Go
learned
ahead.
about the nature. We learned about the nature of God. We see characters that, reveal human nature and how they interact with God. So, okay. I see where
And if I mention his name, most of you know who I'm talking about. I had a man in the back of this church building one Sunday morning who told me we ought to take the Bible at Acts 1 and cut it off. And everything from Acts 1 back all the way back to Genesis need to be thrown in the garbage can. That all we need is a new covenant. And I said, you're dead wrong. And he said, why? And I told him the same thing that I'm about to tell you. Number one, Romans 15:4. Whatsoever four things are written aforetime are written for our learning. Patience and comfort of the Scriptures we might have hope. The Old Testament is there for us to learn from. Number two, one of the ways we prove the deity of Jesus Christ is through those Old Testament prophets and their fulfillment of the New Covenant. If we don't have the Old Testament, we have those prophecies, how do we know that? When Matthew chapter 1, when Matthew talked about the fact Christ was born of a virgin, and there was a fulfillment of a prophecy about, if I don't have Isaiah, how do I know that? He was born in Bethlehem as a fulfillment of a prophecy. If I don't have Micah 5, how do I know that? So we need those prophecies. And the last thing is, you cannot, it is an impossibility to understand the new covenant without the foundation of the old. And I can illustrate that with one simple word. Hebrews. Explain the book of Hebrews without referring to the law of Moses. You can't do it because the whole book is a comparison. Christ is a better giver of the law. Christ is a better high priest. Christ is better, his law is better than that law. The rest is better than that rest. Just throughout the whole book, it's a comparison between the two. And if you don't have the thing to compare it to, you can't do that. I know the comparison is not exactly the same. But someone talked about the fact that when the first government the United States ever lived under as a country, do you know what that was? And it was not the Constitution. It was the Articles of Confederation. And I studied about those things when I was in class, when I was in school. That's part of history class. I'm not sure it is anymore, but it was when I was in school anyway. We don't live under the Articles of Confederation anymore. But we can learn something. We can learn that kind of government that they tried to instill didn't work. That's why it was replaced with the Constitution. There's a lot of things we can learn from the law that teach us about God, that teach us about His nature, that teach us about who He is, that teach us about sin, about the consequences of sin, about how God, all those things we can learn from studying the old law. So we need to study it.
There are a number of things in the Old Testament that gives us proof of inspiration to show us that the only way they could be there is because they were inspired by God.
Two very quick points. I want to look at verse 19 and verse 20, and this won't take very long. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. The first thing is, he talks about the least of these commandments. Jesus was accommodating the language that the Pharisees used. The Pharisees talked about least commandments, important commandments. They talked about, this is important, this is not. Remember, Jesus talked to them about that in Matthew 23. He's not saying that one commandment is more important than the other. He's not saying one commandment is less important than the other. He's simply accommodating the language that they use. This is what you say. If you take what you consider to be the least important commandment, and you teach people not to do it, and you don't do it yourself, you will be least in the kingdom. That word least, I don't think is not talking about eternal destiny. It's talking about quality in the kingdom itself. And at that particular point, I think he's talking about the Jewish nation at that point. I don't think he's talking about the church. You're one of the best people in the kingdom. You're one of the worst people in the kingdom because you're teaching people not to keep the law. It's quality, not eternal destiny. Last thing is verse 20, I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. What was the worst problem with the righteousness of the Pharisees? Hypocrisy. It was fake. They were doing everything right out here. And there was nothing right in here. When Jesus said our righteousness needs to exceed the righteousness of the Pharisees, I read one person who said, the Pharisees said there were 231 commandments in the old law. Now, I think there's more than that. 231. And if they kept 230, we got to keep 231. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about the fact that our service to God needs to be from the heart. It needs to be sincere. It needs to be heartfelt. It does not need to be fake and hypocritical and artificial, which is what the Pharisees were. Read Jesus' description of them in Matthew 23. How many of you will take a dish in the kitchen and wash the outside of it and leave the inside dirty? If I was going to do either, I'd do the opposite. Because the food's on the inside. Fact of the matter is, if I did that, my wife would kill me. I don't wash very dishes very often, but when you do both sides of it. You're like whited sepulchres. Cemetery. Outside, you appear beautiful. Some of the most beautiful places in the world are cemeteries. They're kept up, they're maintained, they're manicured, they look gorgeous from the outside. You go up in one of those tombs and find out what happens. They're full of dead men's bones. Think about the fact if God told you your heart was full of dead bones and was decaying and rotting and corrupt. That's what Christ said about the Pharisees. And that's the comparison he's making. Not you have to keep more laws than they do. Not that you have to give more than they do. I've heard people talk about the fact, well, the Pharisees gave so much. You got to give more than the Pharisees. I don't think that has anything to do with it. It has to do with the heart. If the heart's right, the giving will be right. If the heart's right, the obedience will be right. If the heart's right, the life will be right. And the Pharisees were trying to force it by making the life right without making the heart right. And that's difficult, and I would suggest to you probably impossible. And all you have to do to understand that is look at the cross. Jesus being crucified is an embodiment of the Pharisees' heart. Question or comment? Keep them and teach them. Keep them and teach them. Whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom. You are the best citizens of the kingdom because you keep the law and you teach others to keep the law. But in this context, he's still talking about the law being enforced. It was not fulfilled until Christ died. Up until the death of Christ, the old law was still in effect. And there are some scholars, and I lean toward that way, who say the gospel really wasn't in effect until the day of Pentecost. Because that was the first time people were told how to obey the gospel. And I don't know how you put the gospel in effect for 40 days without somebody knowing what they need to do. I don't think it is. I think it's talking about the Jewish nation. God, the kingdom of heaven is a phrase that means God's people. And so in any context, you're talking about God's people, you have to understand who it is you're talking about. When you're under the law, you're talking about the nation of Israel. When you're under the new law, you're talking about the church. Anyone else? I'm done.